entirely in the little town of Bethlehem. For Bethlehem, that house of bread serves as the stunning contrast to the age of the judges. For it's the home of Boaz, who becomes known as the most famous of all kinsman redeemers. It is this story of redeeming love where Boaz, at great cost to himself, redeems the Moabite widow Ruth, who has come back from Moab with her widowed mother-in-law, Naomi. And it's through this marriage that Ruth and Boaz produce Obed, and Obed has another son, and his son is named Jesse, and that's the next story that comes from this little town. That's the time when Samuel, the last of the judges, and also a prophet, is sent by the Lord to anoint the next king of Israel. Saul is doing a terrible job, and he gets there, and he thinks, I'm going to anoint this big strapping guy, the eldest son of Jesse, and the Lord says, not him. All right, then the next one, he's just about as big and just about as strapping, not him either. And he works his way down, until finally he gets through all the sons, and none of the sons that are there are the one he's to anoint. And he's standing there with oil saying, Lord, I thought you said to come. He says to Jesse, is there anybody else? He says, well, there's the youngest, but we keep him out in the fields. He's just a shepherd boy. He's probably out there writing poems and hitting lions with slingshot stones. And so it is that David, the shepherd boy, is anointed king over all Israel and becomes their highest and greatest king. In fact, to David, the Lord gives a covenant that says that he will have an everlasting throne, and one of his sons will reign upon that everlasting throne. There's another story there. Later in the days of David, the Philistines have taken Bethlehem, and the Philistine troops are garrisoning Bethlehem, and David says, oh, for a drink from the well of Bethlehem, and 3 of his mighty men go and swack a bunch of Philistines so they can draw water from the well. And David won't drink it. He pours it out on the ground. He says, I will not drink what has cost the blood of men. But as the fortunes of Judah and Israel begin to fail and to fall, as things begin to decline in the days of the latter prophets, the only mention that is ever made of Bethlehem or Ephrath is this one in the book of Micah. Micah was a prophet in the southern kingdom. This is after the time of the division, the northern kingdom, Israel or Ephraim. The southern kingdom is Judah, based in Jerusalem. And Micah is prophet to the southern kingdom, and he's a prophet about the time that Isaiah is also a prophet. Isaiah is probably 20 years older than Micah. But it's interesting that the prophecy of Micah that speaks of Bethlehem, which we're going to look at here in a moment, is related historically to the prophecy that we looked at last week. Last week, if you remember, we saw Isaiah and Shear-Jashub, his son, making their way across the washer's field to meet Ahaz, who was out there inspecting the water supply, anticipating any time a siege from Syria and Israel to fall upon him. And the message to Ahaz was to stand firm and to not be troubled by the 2 kings that were coming against him, for their plans would not stand. The Lord commanded Ahaz, you remember last week, ask for a sign. Ahaz said, I'm too pious for that. He wasn't too pious for that. He had made other plans. He said, I don't need a sign from the Lord. I don't need the Lord to deliver me. I'll take care of myself and this kingdom. I've made arrangements with Assyria. Assyria is going to save us. And you remember at the end of last week's sermon, I gave you a little glimpse into the fact that Assyria did not save them. Although the word of the Lord was true, Syria and Israel, both of them were wiped out long before Assyria was an issue at all. But Assyria was no help to Israel. In fact, it was a great hindrance. And the words that we read here, this one single verse from Micah, is timed about 35 years after the confrontation between Elijah and Ahaz. So that confrontation between Elijah and Ahaz, the Lord himself will give you a sign, the virgin will conceive and will bear a son, and they will call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. That prophecy, 35 years later, Micah's prophecy comes, but you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient days. Now listen, this prophecy about Bethlehem, this emerges in the midst of dark times. Isaiah's prophecy emerged in the midst of threats of violence, threats of trouble, of two neighboring nations who would come and lay siege upon Judah. And Isaiah comes to him and says, that won't happen. It will come to nothing. Their plans will fail. God says it is so. Ask for a sign. And he says, I won't ask. This prophecy comes in the midst of genuine trouble. Very likely the events of 701 BC, when already Ahaz is dead, Israel is conquered, Syria is defeated, and the Assyrians overrun the borders of Judah and even come up to lay siege on Jerusalem. That's very likely what Micah is talking about when he says, call out your troops. Siege is laid against you. But what does he mean when he speaks here of you, Bethlehem Ephratah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah? What does that mean? Well, Bethlehem was relatively small in the days of Jesus. It was about the size of Port Dover, about 6,000 people. Too small for a garrison of troops to be summoned forth from there. Too small to add very much to the power of Israel. And yet all of Israel knows the history of Bethlehem Ephratah, the city of David. This is the place where God drew out the great king. But he goes on to say, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient days. Now listen, we cannot read these prophetic words without our mind automatically going to Jesus, because we know that story. But before Jesus actually made his appearance, I want you to know that the Jews, their minds didn't have a name. They didn't have a name Jesus, but they did have a word Christ or Messiah. And they believed and understood this is a messianic prophecy. When the wise men show up in Jerusalem with gifts saying, where is the one born king of the Jews? And Herod has a fit because Herod is this nervous, can't think of the word. He's deeply suspicious, conspiracy theory, everything. Anyways, Herod's really upset about this. He doesn't want any threats to the throne. And he says, well, where is this one to be born king of the Jews? And he calls for the Jewish scribes, and the Jewish scribes come in, and they open the books, and they go right here to Micah. They say, this is what we're expecting, Bethlehem Ephratah, because there is one who is to come. They're anticipating not Hezekiah, who is currently king, but there is a future king coming, and this is the fascinating thing. It is a future king whose origins are from of old, from ancient times. From of old could point back and say, well, he'll be a descendant of David, but that ancient times pushes us all the way back to the very nth degree of time. This is to be something entirely different. All of the clues and the hints are there. How does any of this help us in the midst of a secular age that challenges your faith claims and says all of that stuff is nonsense? We don't believe in any of this supernatural stuff. Well, here's the other part. We need to hear about the people for a minute. That was the place, and now this is the history. Between these two stories, both Gospels mention Bethlehem. In Matthew's Gospel, he tells the story a little later of the Magi's arrival and quotes from Micah. Luke tells the earlier story. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. And this was the first registration where Quirinius was governor of Syria. And all went to be registered, each to his own town. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. Listen, there's 6 names here, and I want to just focus in on these 6 names as we come to the end of this sermon. And you might go, I don't know where we're going today. This is kind of wandering all over the place, and don't worry, we're going somewhere. The greatest of all these names. If you have a poll, you take Luke's account, you tear out those 6 verses, and you go for a walk. You're going to go for a walk, and you're going to go for a walk. Let's go for a walk through the streets of Rome in the year 753 AUC. In the days since the founding of the city of Rome, it's been 753 years. We've got 6 names on a piece of paper. We're going to do a survey. Who is the most famous? We've got Caesar Augustus. He's the most famous. Hands down, the most famous. Probably next to him, as far as fame goes, is Herod the Great. He's the oldest of all of them. He's way older than Caesar Augustus. In fact, he's pretty much on his last legs by this time. And then we've got Quirinius. He'd be less known, but he'd still be known. He was a Roman nobleman who had been made, first he had been consul in Syria, and now he is going to be made governor in Syria. All those names, at least the educated people of Rome, everybody would know Caesar Augustus because they've got coins in their pocket that say, Savior of the world, Caesar Augustus. They go, we know that guy. He's the most famous man around. He's been Caesar for a quarter of a century already. He's the most powerful. He commands the armies. He commands the taxes. Everybody knows Caesar Augustus. Just about everybody knows Herod the Great because he's such a wicked, wretched, awful, terrible man. The man kills his own wife and 3 of his sons in order to keep his throne because he's afraid they're competing with him. It's no surprise that he slays the children of Bethlehem. He's a maniac. And everybody in the Roman Empire knows about Herod the Great. He makes front page news everywhere. Quirinius, yeah, if you follow geopolitical things, Quirinius was consul in Syria, the province, and soon will be made governor in Syria. Now, what about Joseph? Do you know Joseph? Joseph who? Joseph who? Now, here's an interesting thing. Think about this for a moment. Have you ever considered who Joseph actually is? In our story, Joseph is some poor carpenter who lives and works nearly 150 kilometers away from his home in the town of Nazareth. He's had to go that far to find work. And he's not doing very well. We know this because when the time comes to bring a sacrifice to dedicate this newborn son, Joseph and his betrothed wife Mary, they don't bring a lamb, they bring turtle dove, which is the offering of the poor. He's a poor man who doesn't have very much, and he lives 150 kilometers away from home, and he's had to travel all the way home. Who is this guy? Had Ahaz decided differently when the Lord said, ask for a sign, had Ahaz trusted the Lord instead of trusting Assyria, this story, and God has reasons for it to be written the way it is and not the way it could have been, this story could have been written in those days, King Joseph of the line and house of David. This is David's heir. There's no reason to think that this guy would not have been king over all Israel, that he would have had a throne in Jerusalem where Herod's palace was. This is the rightful ancestral king of the Hebrews whose line has fallen into such obscurity that nobody knows his name. If you ask on the streets of Rome or Athens or Corinth, you know Joseph? Never heard of him. How about Mary? Even less influence, even less importance than her betrothed husband. In the eyes of the world, she's just some poor, pregnant Jewish girl with so little money and so little future, she can't even get a guest room and has to put her baby in a cattle's manger. To those who know her better, she's open to scandal because she has born this child before her marriage has been consummated. She is a person of very small influence. And finally, there's the baby. on the streets of Rome, do you know Jesus? Never heard of him. Do you think Jesus will make any difference in the world? Tell me more about him. Born to a poor carpenter and his betrothed wife, and lying right now in a manger in the city of Bethlehem. Where? Bethlehem. Where? Bethlehem Ephrathah. Where? Somewhere over in Palestine. Oh, that vassal state over there that isn't of very much significance to us over here in Rome. Yeah, he's not going to amount to much. To every human eye, this is the order of things. Listen, I could get into more dating, but you guys don't want the dates. You can ask me about that later, those of you who are real history wonks. How we triangulate between Augustus and his rule, and Quirinius and his rule, and King Herod the Great, whose role is so significant. It triangulates things so that Jesus is probably born in what we would today think of as sometime between 6 and 4 BC, counting backwards. So a little bit earlier than 0. But laying that aside, here's what I want you to think about. And if this is really the only thing for today. What evidence do I have that Jesus is the most significant being who has ever lived? The fact that even if you go by BCE and CE, you're still stuck with why are we dating our calendars this way? Well, you go Dionysius, and the Pope who had him write up that calendar was really committed to this Jesus guy, and now we're stuck with it. Yes, you're right. But why was he really committed to that Jesus guy? I mean, if you tried as hard as you could here in Norfolk County to make something out of somebody, anybody, pick the most important person in the county, pick the mayor if you want, could you make that person so significant that all the world would know them? That 580 years after their birth, some pope in Rome says to some monk in Rome, draw up a calendar and split the time between when that person was born. This is the evidence I offer to you. And this is why I say to you, faith is not blind. Faith has something to stand upon. Because if you went through the streets of Simcoe and asked this question, do you know where Caesar Augustus was born? You know how many people would be able to answer that question? There are people who know. I could tell you. I had to go look it up, though. But if you were to ask most people in the street, do you know where Jesus was born? Even people who have never been to church would say Bethlehem. They might have to think for a moment. They'd get the answer right. Do you know what Herod the Great's mother's name was? He had one. She has a name. You can look it up. But if you were to ask the average person on the street, what was the name of Herod the Great's mother? This man was famous throughout the Roman Empire. He was a great despot. He was terrifyingly famous. Nobody knows his mother's name, but if you were to ask the average person on the street, do you know the name of Jesus' mother? People get that right. One more question. Can you give me one single quote, one little line, one famous saying of Quirinius, governor of Syria? No? I think most people, and this one may be less than the other two, but most people, even if you were to offer them some lines, would be able to say, Jesus said that. Listen, the world may be very secular. The world may say we don't want anything to do with Jesus, but the reality is he is the most significant being who has ever lived. And all the evidence we have points us in a direction that says that shouldn't be so. He shouldn't have mattered. Caesar Augustus, Herod the Great, Quirinius, these are the men whose names should matter. These are the men who maybe someday somebody will split time on the basis of who they are. But Joseph, Mary, and Jesus, the common era began when God sent forth his son, born of a woman and born amongst men. And that is Christmas in the midst of space and time. As we prepare to break bread together, we're going to sing I've lost my bulletin. We're going to sing O Little Town of Bethlehem. Somebody call out that number for me. 169. Thanks, Nate. 169. Let's stand together as we sing O Little Town of Bethlehem.